Welcome back to the show, everybody. Love my new intro. Thank you, Jayme CheeseSlice on the ones and twos, our engineer extraordinaire, producer. The guy is running several shows at one time. Uncontrolled Opposition was over on the Truth Wire for the WBAI recording, and Jayme was doing two interviews at one time as I was talking to the last American vagabond, a truther, if you want to call or classify him. I don't know why we have to classify anybody, but I like to classify people sometimes if it helps show that we have diversity of thought and we can speak to people who think differently than us, people who don't share our same opinions. We can still be adults and come to some conclusions. I think we need more of that than ever because right now we're in a tribal thrust, a thrust by the government, the ruling class, to keep everybody in tribes, to keep people fighting with each other so the ruling class, the oligarchs, run off with all the money. Like George Carlin said, happens to work. Very good, simple concept, but happens to work. And it's a big club, and you ain't in it. But in my club, in my circle, in my friends, it doesn't make a difference if you're a libertarian, a conservative, a leftist, an anarchist, a truther, whatever you are, as long as you're willing to have conversations about what's best for Americans and present true information out there. We need media more than ever, real media out there. And those voices right now, whether you believe it or not, those are the most suppressed voices out there. I know a guy, I think he's suppressed. He should have millions of views because I love his stuff. He's such a great person. And he is Italian, so it helps me out. The guy who grows his own tomatoes, makes his own pasta, and he also writes for the Libertarian Institute, the antiwar.com website. You know him, ladies and gentlemen. My paisan, Kyle Anzalone, is with us.
Pasta, thank you so much for that intro.
Look, I pride myself in having the best intros out there, getting people hyped. I'm a hype man, and I'm hyping you because you are somewhat of a liberty-minded person, a libertarian-minded person. I don't want to call you a libertarian necessarily because, you know, I did that to Daniel McAdams, and he's like, I'm not a libertarian, I'm just liberty-minded, because that party has a lot of problems. A lot of those people in that party had blinders on and didn't look at like all the stuff that Donald Trump did. He was a hardcore Zionist. And the guy wanted pre-crime in his first administration, but you weren't one of those people. You stood strong, you stood tall, and you did the right thing, not support one of the people, the two-party duopoly, which is just a two-party illusion. Speaking of this administration, it seems to be that their greatest accomplishment, unfortunately, because we have so many xenophobic people in this country, I'm just going to call it like it is, so many people who believe that immigration is the big issue out there, that if you fix immigration, everything else will fall into place. Really mind-boggling because that's an illusion right there. They're making you look at the immigrants so you don't look at them, the ruling class. But let's talk about ICE, because I believe you believe in the Constitution. There might be some legal actions in which ICE takes, but it's an illegal force as far as wearing masks, not identifying themselves. And before we get into the micros, I want to talk about the macros. If they commit illegal actions, in other words, the way they obtain information or withhold people or question people or bring them into custody, if they do it through an illegal method, doesn't that make everything they do illegal?
Well, it certainly does. And they are an absolute, at this point, uncontrolled, untrained, and low IQ military force. And because they're allowing them to wear masks and just run around American cities and have the full endorsement for everything they do from President Donald Trump at the White House, it's turned into a police force. I mean, this is like the worst nightmare of Trump's immigration policy. I think people reasonably wanted the border to be closed after seeing tens of millions of people stream across during Biden's 4 years. Well, Trump went in and closed the border. Fine. But the execution of the immigration policy and what it now means for Americans to, again, have these low IQ guys running around our streets in body armor, masks, and with rifles is very dangerous for everyone.
Well, the two new, Jayme, you got me? All right, thank you, Jayme. The two new leaks or new sources of information out there, the new hottest ones right now that people are talking about is two. We now saw through the Wall Street Journal, through documents obtained, that there's a quota system. And the quota system is not on convictions. It's on arrest, right? And then we also see now, to another a document leaked that the director of ICE told his agents that they can go into a house without a judicial warning. Oh, judicial warrant, excuse me. I'm so hyped up, I can't even get my words out there. Can you explain, not just to my audience, but maybe to the Trumpers out there, how these two situations are really, really, really bad for Americans?
Right. Well, again, all these people are pretty stupid, it seems to me, all these ICE officers out there carrying around guns. And they're told by their superiors, you got to arrest 1,000 people a month. And so what are they going to do? They're going to start scooping up children because they're the easiest people to arrest. And so now you have horror shows like 5-year-olds getting detained by ICE. I mean, it's absolutely maddening and sickening. And look, for those Americans out there that think we need some kind of stern immigration policy, or at least to have a closed border, this is turning the average American against Trump's immigration policy, which includes a closed border. So that part of it is a disaster. I think the bigger issue, as you kind of allude to there, is on the grounds of the Fourth Amendment, right? That we are really losing control of this to these ICE agents. As again, as you point out, they covered that they could just go into a house without any kind of warrant, without an arrest warrant, without a cause, and just go in because they think somebody bad is there. And Pasta, I don't know if you saw this, but Joseph Kotz over at 404 Media did a story on ICE using an AI program. And it when I heard about this story, it reminded me of the reporting that 972 magazine had done on the Gaza war, where they had this AI program called Lavender, where they assigned all the people in Gaza a score. And if your score as being likely linked to Hamas was too high, they put you on a kill list and then just executed you and your entire family. So what ICE has is it's a AI designed by Palantir called Elite. And it, they say it pulls up like a Google map. And so, you see all the different houses, and you could click on the house and it gives you a confidence score that a person who may be violating immigration law is in that home. And why I think this is really important to the Fourth Amendment is because all these big tech companies and all of these U.S. intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies are buying up all of our data from Facebook, from Google, from all these other companies that, we use their apps, and we allow them to have a lot of permissions, a lot of access to our phones, where we are, what we're searching for, and who we are and all that. And so these intelligence communities are essentially buying all of our data up, plugging it into an AI program, and then using that to go and arrest people based on what the AI is telling them. And at no point do they need a warrant or to have really any oversight or review of this entire process. And while they would need, the government should have to go to a judge and say, we suspect this person has committed this crime, whether that they're in the country illegally or they assaulted somewhere, something like that, and then request the, time frame in which they need the data from that person, from these certain companies, and then take that warrant to those companies. But rather than doing that, they're just buying that information from these big tech firms. And so this is destroyed the Bill of Rights here.
Yep. So I was going to get into that, the fact that now that we know that Palantir, and I want to lay something out there for you to make a comment on too as well. This is not just about data mining or geo mapping or whatever you want to call it, or building a database on immigrants. This is about American citizens that are going on that database. Shouldn't that be game, set, and match for any of the Trump people that are holding on? Because the two things that Donald Trump, that was the most appetizing things about why you support Donald Trump, is that, number one, he wanted to return to the Constitution. He wanted to return to freedom of speech. A lot of Trump people were getting labeled as domestic terrorists, and they were getting censored. Remember, we had the Twitter files, and that was something we were supposed to depend on the Trump administration for. That's obviously out the window. The second part was about not being a technocrat, not going along with the Klaus Schwabs and the WEFs. Well, he's at the left right now, and this combination, this joint effort between ICE and Palantir, seems that he's kind of violated the two most things that we were standing behind him to begin with in the first place. I don't want to say we, but anybody, because I never voted for him and I knew he was going to be like this. But shouldn't this be game, set, and match for the people who are still holding on and following Donald Trump?
Right. And look, Pasta, I think me and you both looked at Trump's first administration and knew who the man was. And so how his second administration would go, and that he wasn't going to do all these good things that either people he put in his administration or that he suggested, like ending the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
At the same time, a lot of people thought, well, this is the best hope possible. And so, they basically just injected themselves with some extra optimism in hopes that Trump would do some good things, because the other option they saw was Kamala Harris, who had promised to do no good things whatsoever. But most of those people, I think, who are really optimistic about Trump had already abandoned the president over Epstein, over Israel, over not ending the war in Ukraine. Even if they said, well, he's good on immigration, all these other things outweigh it. And so all you have left in like the pro-Trump camp in the United States now are the people who are just going to be reflectively pro-Trump on every issue. And so while 2 years ago, they might have said that Joe Biden, going to war in some country would be unconstitutional without a declaration of war from Congress. You have people like Senator Mike Lee now saying that, it was perfectly legal to go in and kidnap Maduro. So they're just going to make up any excuse because they just support the president.
So being an advocate at antiwar.com, a writer, whatnot, I consider you a Ron Paul libertarian of sorts. You're a non-interventionist. I don't know. For me, the one thing that I've been surprised from nation states is Iran. The way they handled themselves against Israel months ago when they had their little war, the hypersonic missiles getting through really seemed to shock Israel. Now we had this attempt at another regime change on the ground over there, and it failed miserably. Do you look at Iran as an adversary that can handle its own now, and it's going to be, it's going to make the West, the United States and Israel, think twice about regime changing Iran in the future after what we've seen them their capabilities this last year?
Well, I think I guess, at least saw over the past week that Iran does have the military capability to make Donald Trump think twice. I mean, if you look at what happened last week, the military was ready for a strike. The European countries were ready for a strike. The Iranians were ready for a strike to come on Wednesday. And Netanyahu called Donald Trump and said Israel isn't prepared for an Iranian counterstrike. And what that really meant is America didn't have enough military assets in the Middle East to repel the Iranian counterattack. And so now the U.S. is sending the THAAD interceptors back, more Patriot interceptor systems, an entire aircraft carrier strike group, and fighter jets to the Middle East. And so, yes, I think that Iran packs enough of a punch to make the U.S. and Israel think twice, but that's all they're going to think about it. I don't think Iran survived the regime change yet. I think another U.S. strike is coming in the Middle East after they get all the military assets in place, which with the air defense systems is probably going to take a couple weeks, and we're going to see them try to overthrow the Iranian government again.
I know you're not a military guy, right? I know you're a peace advocate and a libertarian, but do you think that Iran has enough punch to really cause some serious damage to Israel if it's something heats up again?
Yeah, and U.S. military bases that are scattered throughout the Middle East. I mean, the U.S. is trying to consolidate its forces in just a few countries, but Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq are all much closer to Iran than Israel is. And so I would imagine those are far easier targets for the Iranians to hit should they choose to do so. The problem with that Iran has is they're essentially getting into a fist fight with somebody who has a gun, right? Both the US and Israel have nuclear weapons. And so when people will talk about the 12-day war, where I do think it was Israel that cried uncle and said that we can't keep having these Iranian missiles slip through, and we don't have the interceptors to repel those missiles. Iran kind of did have to agree to the ceasefire, because if they start to win the war by too big of a gap on the conventional arms,
the Samson option,
then Israel is going to nuke Iran.
Yeah, that's the Samson option, right? They can refer to nuclear weapons. What do you think about this whole peace panel in Gaza right now? As far as Donald Trump, I mean, we saw they asked Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin says, we're not going to go agree to any peace panel until the United States abides by the UN charter in which they had wrote years ago and whatnot, and they treat the Palestinians with respect. This isn't about, real peace. This is just about kind of masking what's really going on and trying to legitimize Gaza, Israel's control over Gaza. What's your thought on this panel?
Yeah, I think it's all just a show, right? Israel has no intention of allowing this peace deal to end the war in Gaza, right? We saw just yesterday they killed 11 people, 2 children, 3 journalists. So there really isn't even an actual ceasefire. In no other conflict will we call this a ceasefire. I mean, it is a pretty significant reduction in the amount of Palestinians being killed every day by Israel. But, going from 100 Palestinians being killed every day by Israel to 5 is not an actual ceasefire. And for no other country would that be acceptable. The Israelis have made clear they're not going to allow the Rafah crossing to reopen. Trump and Netanyahu have made clear that if Hamas doesn't disarm, they're going back to war. Hamas has made clear that they're not going to unilaterally disarm. They would be willing to just disarm in the creation of an independent Palestinian state. But Netanyahu says that's not going to happen. So overall, this board of peace is actually going nowhere. I think it's just all a big show right now. And I covered this at antiwar.com about a week ago. And that was that Israel is going to go back to war in Gaza in March. And they're basically, just giving their troops a little bit of rest. They're ramping up some operations in the West Bank. They're conducting some additional strikes against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, but really are alleged Hezbollah targets. I think mostly they're just destroying civilian infrastructure over there for potentially the process to just annex Lebanon south of the Litani River. I think that's a real possibility that we should consider and look at. But on Gaza, I do think the Israelis are going back to war, and it'll start with an invasion of Gaza City in March.
Okay, that was my next question. What's in store in Gaza? And it's kind of sad, though, the way it's like completely censored out of the news. They're not even talking about it. Like I throw on Fox News and MSNBC and CNN and Newsmax just to see what they're talking about. They don't even talk like anything is going on in Israel anymore. And it's all American hardware that's really pushing this whole situation. In other words, Israel wouldn't be able to do what they're doing without America's help. Is that a fair statement to say what's going on? So all this is just kabuki theater, that if we really wanted to have a peace deal, we would just pull the plug on the weaponry that we give to Israel?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's not just that we send Israel bombs, it's that we send them the spare parts for their fighter jets and things that had to be changed every few flights, right? And so if we stop sending them, I think tires for the aircraft is one, but just all kinds of spare parts for the F-16s and F-35s, then the Israeli Air Force is going to be grounded or severely restricted in their operations within probably just a couple of months. And even Israeli generals and former leaders have come out and said that without the United States, we can't conduct war in Gaza. We can't conduct war throughout the Middle East. And so Israel militarily is entirely dependent on the United States, not just to replenish the bombs, but to actually keep their military fighting, because a lot of it is American made. Right. So that's important. And one other thing I'd like to add, because, you're mentioning there the lack of media coverage about Gaza now, the ceasefire worked really well for the Israelis on the American mainstream media, because there was actually starting to be a lot of coverage of the situation in Gaza over the summer. Images of the starving children, the international freedom flotillas that tried to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza. There was a lot more media attention. Then the ceasefire went into effect, and the number of Palestinians went again from about 100 a day to 5 a day, and then the media coverage just stopped, right? Just imagine if this was Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine agreed to a ceasefire, but Russia just was killing, 5 or 10 or 20 Ukrainians a day rather than 2, 3, 400. Would they say, oh, Russia is testing the ceasefire? No, they would say Russia violated the ceasefire and it no longer exists because they've killed Ukrainians every single day for 3 months of the ceasefire.
What are your thoughts on what's going on in Russia, Ukraine? I know it's a little bit off topic. I wasn't planning on asking you that question, but uh, this attempted assassination on Putin, which was going to be the talk of the town until we went in there and kidnapped Maduro, right? And the media went away from that. Nobody really talked about that. But the way we saw the Russian media, and we saw Vladimir Putin shortly after that in fatigues, right? And then they go to their Duma, I believe, which is their parliamentary body, and they talk about the fact that they're changing the language from military operation to all-out war. This hasn't been getting a lot of attention out there. What are your thoughts? What's going on in Russia, Ukraine right now? And could this escalate? From what I understand, Russia's been sending more hardware to go after the infrastructure in Kiev, and a lot of the lights been turned out. What could this kind of snowball into?
Yeah, so the war has escalated under President Donald Trump. And a lot of people don't think that because we don't have the weekly or bi-weekly announcements that the US is sending 700, 800 million to $3 billion in weapons to Ukraine. However, the Biden administration did kind of preempt Trump by approving a lot more weapons for Ukraine than they needed at the moment in order to have a big stockpile. And they put that stockpile under the control of NATO. So there are still a lot of weapons going to Ukraine. But the way I think Trump has really escalated this conflict is by providing Ukraine with more intelligence to hit targets deep inside Russia. For whatever reason, Trump has been convinced that if he allows Ukraine to hit Russian energy sites and things like that far away from the front lines, that's going to put a lot of pressure on Vladimir Putin to agree to a deal. That obviously didn't work. And at the very least, Ukraine exploited that intelligence if the U.S. intelligence community actually didn't just outright help the Ukrainians try to hit one of Vladimir Putin's residences in Ukraine with a long-range drone strike. And predictably, Russia has fired back at Ukraine. They've launched another Oreshnik missile. As you mentioned, they've been knocking out the lights and power and heat in Kiev as temperatures are, I believe, negative in the capital city of Ukraine right now. So certainly very, very uncomfortable there. I will say, I do think, as we have seen throughout this war, that while there might be some very hawkish rhetoric coming out of Russia, Russia is careful on how they climb the escalation ladder. Sorry about the camera malfunction there. I think I got it back up. So the Ukrainians are going to be careful, or the Russians, are going to be careful about how far they escalated. I don't think they're going to go into some mode where they're really conducting.
But Kyle, Oreshniks, right? You said Oreshniks. Can you explain that's a weapon they haven't used before in the past?
Well, they used it once before. It was the second time they've used it.
Yes.
It's probably their most advanced missile at this. I mean, they have some other like very long range missiles for, potential nuclear confrontation with the U.S. But as far as what they're going to use in Ukraine, it's probably their most advanced weapon, and it's capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. But of course, because of the massive speeds that it flies, they don't even have to put a warhead on it to do a tremendous amount of damage. So this is a really serious and powerful weapon.
Yeah. I think a lot of this also compares to some of the hypersonic missiles that Iran has. When they start talking about, okay, the United States has not produced enough air defense missiles, even if they produce them to try and shoot these suckers down, it's almost impossible. You're trying to fire a bullet at a bullet. It's going to be like, you're not going to get all these. And this spells something differently. Do you think that Russia can continue at this point to try to find a peace deal without taking Kiev? Because it seems to me this is all about, all right, let's turn the lights out. Let's make it cold. Let's get the majority of the people to flee now, knowing that something's coming big, and then have your invasion and take Kiev, because it seems like they've come to a point, and I've said this for quite some time, I don't see this conflict ending without Russia taking Kiev, because they're always going to have a hostile, we hate you, Nazi mentality, right? Where there's a lot of the banderas and the banderites there that are in control, that hate the Russians so much. How can they do this? How can they end this conflict or find peace without taking Kiev?
Yeah, I mean, the only way that actually could be done, and I think this is completely unlikely to happen, is that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump would have to have a discussion, and Trump would have to send probably 100 of the like best American special forces to Kiev to protect Zelensky through the negotiating process. Seeing how that's not going to happen, I do think the Russians will, if not take Kiev, they would, effectively be able to negotiate. Force the Ukrainians to negotiate at the barrel of a Russian gun, whether that happens from the Russians actually moving on Kiev or just a complete collapse of the Ukrainian army, which I think may be the more likely scenario. I do think that's how this war is going to end, with the Ukrainians basically having the terms of the peace agreement dictated to them by the Russians. And then whoever it is in Kiev, it probably won't be Zelensky, because I don't think that Trump would, have the understanding that, hey, I need to send Zelensky protection for him to get this done. And some Ukrainian leader will be told by the Russians what's going to happen, and they'll write it down, and that'll be the end of the conflict. Hopefully it doesn't actually come to an actual invasion of the capital city. I mean, what a horror show that would be for the poor people of Ukraine, who have been exploited by their own leadership and the leadership of the Western countries to weaken Russia.
It'd also be really tough for the Russians, because you're talking about guerrilla warfare now. You're talking
Yeah.
about, banderites and militias hiding in buildings. It would be terrible if that would have happened. So I do hope we can find a conflict.
Are you aware, by the way, that Zbigniew Brzezinski said, like, I believe it was in 2014, he gave an interview where he talks about how the scenario for Ukraine would basically be Russia fighting street battles against guerrilla forces in the Ukrainian cities. So that's
where I get that information from, the devil's chessboard, right?
Right. Or even Hillary Clinton on the night of the Russia. I'll never forget this. On the night of the Russian invasion, Hillary Clinton was on Rachel Maddow cackling about how Russia had made an Afghanistan style mistake, right? And she's referring to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, where the Soviets go in, the Americans back what, ultimately becomes terrorists.
The Mujahideen.
And, bin Laden's movement grew out of that, of course. She and 2 million Afghans died in that war, and she's laughing. This is, for her, it's fantastic, because that led, at least in the consensus view, that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union. I'm not so sure I agree with that assessment, but I think there's a fair argument to make for it. But Hillary Clinton believes that, and she also believes that this is going to lead to the downfall of Russia.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Hillary Clinton and her husband, they got in there during Boris Yeltsin to fall down fucking drunk. You know what I'm saying? What he let happen in Belgrade. They thought it. They tasted it. It's like, oh, Napoleon couldn't balkanize and take the resources. Hitler couldn't balkanize and take the resources. The Rothschilds tried for years sending militias to guard the oil fields that were taken from the Soviet Union. Now we can get back in there. They tasted it, and they thought they can get it back. This hate for Russia and the Democratic Party, we know exactly where it comes from. So it's a shame that so many leftists go along with Putin's evil. They don't even understand Putin. Like, Putin was like selected by oligarchs of sorts. I think some of the hardliners let him get in there, but he went from an oligarchy to a nationalized mentality, right? He then turned around on the oligarchs and put them in their place. So that taste of balkanization from the Clintons and the left and the corporations, they can taste it at all times. That's why there's so much hate and disdain over here for what's going on. And the hearing about what it would turn into is a shame. That's why I also think the Russians kind of sit back and they're looking at what's going on in Venezuela and going, oh, let's see what happens over there, because that could be a Vietnam situation for America if they try to go into Venezuela and an armed seditiary of militias there. There's so many moving parts right now. It's crazy. Let's talk about Venezuela real quickly. Unless you have anything else to say about Russia, Ukraine. I think you laid it out. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen there. It's really a shame.
I guess the last thing to add, Pasta, is the other thing Trump is doing that is really counterproductive is, even though Russia has completely ruled out the peace agreement that, went from a somewhat reasonable 28-point peace plan that even the Russians said seemed to resemble the framework agreed to between Trump and Putin in Alaska in August of last year, into a full-on treaty with the Ukrainians, where the US, UK, and all the other NATO states are going to sign bilateral agreements with the Ukrainians that Zelensky said will be approved by the US Congress. So I think it will be like a full-on bound treaty, just like NATO. And of course, the Russians' core demand in the whole invasion is that Ukraine must be neutral. And so this idea that Russia is going to sign on to an agreement, any agreement with Ukraine after they've signed a bilateral treaty with the United States and every other NATO nation is an absolute fiction. And so if we actually go forward with a peace deal in which one side, the winning side of the war, is outright refusing, so it's not really a peace deal, it's just a treaty with Ukraine. But if we move forward with that, it's going to rule out any potential negotiations with the government of Ukraine until there's a full-on Russian enforced regime change in Kiev.
Interesting. We'll see. We can only cross our fingers. This thing's been going on in the word 24 hours and stuff. So many of those libertarians pointed out how Donald Trump escalated the war his first term. Remember, he even said it. I gave you, what did he say? Stinger missiles? Not Stinger missiles. Javelin. I gave you javelins. Obama gave you sheets. I gave you javelins. That's an escalation. He goes to fire at those tanks. It's like, hello, can people look at this guy, the part that he played him the first time right now around? You want to go blindly the second time? I mean, I know so many people put down on paper, Kyle, that was one of the reasons, that they looked at Trump as the lesser of two evils, is the fact that he is at least going to end this war that Biden started and escalated. And by the way, it was kind of interesting, if you remember, Putin cured COVID because the Congress, the United States Congress, especially the Democrats, were just fixated on always talking about everything COVID, get your shot, forcing mandates. And then all of a sudden, when they were about to scale down, Putin invades Ukraine, and they have the Ukrainian flags, and they're not talking about COVID anymore. They use that whole moment to get away from a crime against humanity, which they escalated and they pushed. It's a shame for what's going on in the United States right now. So many people are dying of turbo cancers, and there's a lot of people pointing back to like, hey, maybe we should look at what the shot did to people and what's happening, but people don't want to talk about it. We can't even have a conversation. It's gone and forgotten. And you got RFK up there with Donald Trump giving Pfizer new contracts moving forward. So, yeah, no accountability. Venezuela. Let's end the show on Venezuela. Let's talk a little about Venezuela. We got about 6 minutes left. After seeing the pictures now of Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president, sworn as the president, she is a Chavista. Her father was a guerrilla. I don't know. You're not really fond of the guerrillas the way us leftists are, but, you know, we like the guerrillas. She's a revolutionist. She very much loved by the Chavista population. She's now in charge. There are pictures surfacing of her shaking a CIA agent. Now, a lot of people can say, hey, you know, she's got to play ball now. She's trying to stop American aggression. They just kidnapped the president. But there are also a lot of people out there that are claiming that there was some type of betrayal from the Venezuelan government against Nicolás Maduro. You analyze a lot of these situations. You obviously can speak intelligently on what's going on in the Ukraine-Russia situation, the Iran-Israel situation. From what you see, do you think there was some form, some degree of betrayal from the Venezuelan government against Nicolás Maduro?
I do. I think it's, if not, it was the most successful military operation maybe in history of all of history. If we are actually able to go in, kidnap the leader of a foreign country when their entire military was trying to stop us and didn't lose a single soldier and took the president and his wife alive, that just doesn't seem believable to me. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be the now interim president Rodriguez who was behind the betrayal. It could have been maybe the commander of a couple air bases that shut off the air defenses or radars or something like that. I do believe somebody betrayed Maduro, and that's what ultimately led to Trump being able to successfully capture him without any American casualties.
What do you see in the near future for Venezuela now that it's still a Chavista in charge? Donald Trump is talking like he's the president and they have the oil. But once again, an armed citizenry. The government armed the citizens. They've done this. They've had this program since when Hugo Chavez got kidnapped and they had to return him 2 days later. Armed citizenry, people who believe in national sovereignty are just not going to lay down. Donald Trump's talking like they have everything, the oil, whatnot. What do you see in the near future for Venezuela? Because I think there's a lot of murkiness when the the mainstream media talks about this. They just show Donald Trump saying, we're working with Venezuela. Awesome people. And I just met this amazing woman. She gave me her Nobel Peace Prize. But we have the oil. We got 50 million barrels. We're taking the oil, and it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be beautiful. But that's just not the case right now. What do you see in the near future?
Yeah, I really don't know. And I think a part of the reason I can't say is because Trump is just so erratic, where he's setting these maximalist demands in a lot of places and at times carrying through with them. You know, he bombed Iran over the summer. He bombed Nigeria on Christmas. He kidnapped Maduro. So Trump is clearly erratic and willing to take military action at seemingly random times, right? That is very dangerous. And so I think it's very possible that the U.S. ends up going in and doing a full-on regime change, attempting a full-on regime change in Venezuela. I think Trump's plan of we're going to take the oil and, you know, we're going to use that money to build up Venezuela. And then in a few years, we're going to install a new government in a peaceful transition is a complete fiction. And that's not going to work. He could just bat down and go home and say, you know, we got a new leader there. That's better than before. And I'm not going to screw around and invest tens of billions of dollars in the oil industry. I'm just going to let that country go. It seems that's what he's done on Greenland now, where, you know, he says we've reached a deal with the Europeans, the framework of it, where they're going to allow us to build some military bases in Greenland, which has been the deal since 1951.
We had 31 bases there right after World War II, right?
Right. And we've scaled down. I think there's just one base there now, but the actual agreement, the treaty between the US and Denmark regarding Greenland would have allowed the US to build 31 military bases there again if we wanted, or 100 if we wanted, right? We could have done this under the current terms of the deal. I think the only difference is it will be the American bases will be on was officially sovereign American territory rather than just an American military base in a Danish colony. But it's a very small distinction there, right? It really doesn't matter whatsoever, right? Like embassies are sovereign territory of the country that, you know, that embassy is of, like the UK embassy in the United States is British territory, but really it's not like, you know, the Brits own that portion of DC or whatever, in the sense that they own the UK, right? So it's all just semantics and completely worthless. So it's really possible for Trump to bat down. And possibly, before I go, I do want to say that as a libertarian, and I think this is the correct libertarian position, I don't care who's in charge of Venezuela, and I don't base whether I like the government or not on what their own internal economic policy is. As far as I could tell, Rodriguez is a better leader than, say, Javier Milei, right? Because at least she cares about her country's sovereignty more than Milei seems to in Argentina, and isn't willing just to sell out and become a piece of the American empire. So I really don't care about what a leader's internal politics are. It's none of my business. I just care about the American government. And as far as I do care what a leader is doing on the global stage, it's mainly just as it relates to the United States of America. And Milei selling out Argentina and the Argentinian people to prop up the American empire isn't good for the American country either. I mean, you know, we spent $40 billion rigging their last election for the guy. It's completely absurd.
Well, you have a lot of explaining to do to the people who showed up at that libertarian convention with Malay hats and flags on and actually touting that he's a libertarian. And I told the chair of the Libertarian Party and many other people there that he is not a libertarian. He's selling out the country to BlackRock. He is loyal to the Zionist. He is not what you think he is. And also, too, I had those arguments about, listen, I get it in libertarian mindset that you want to have less government control. But when you have what's the word? Oh my God, when you're into social programs, a
welfare state?
Oh my God, thank you so much. When you have a welfare state, right, and you do have a lot of people depending on government programs, you can't just yank the chain like that. You have to go slowly, get rid of certain things, make sure people are taken care of. You're going to have people in the streets starving without food, without necessities, and that's the thing. So we have to figure out a way to do this in the right manner. Kyle Anzalone, thank you so much for joining the show. Let everybody know where they can find you, the easiest way to get to all your good stuff. And let me know when your tomatoes are going to be done so I can come visit you. We can make some good gravy or sauce, depending on what you call it on a Sunday.
Yeah, anytime pasta. I always at the end of the season make way too much pasta sauce, so the freezer is absolutely full still. Probably will be for like another 2 or 3 months. But everybody, you can find all my work. Best place to follow me is on at Kyle Anzalone _ I write articles for antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute, and the great Judge Napolitano over at judgenap.com. But all my articles get posted to my own Ets account, so if that's too much to find. And then, of course, my show, which Craig Pasta Jardula has been one of my very fine guests, and I'm hoping to have him back in the coming weeks. The Kyle Anzalone Show, definitely subscribe and follow that. Share it out there. That really helps with the YouTube algorithms. And Pasta, man, thanks for having me. It's always a great time to talk to you.
Kyle, you're one of my favorite people on this planet. I always love what you have to say, but you're also Italian, so that helps you become one of my favorite people on this planet. Kyle Anzalone, everybody, thank you so much for joining us. Guys, we'll be back in a little bit. We still got one more interview today. We had our truther, we had our libertarian or liberty-minded person. Now we got to get our hardcore leftist, our Marxist. Later on, in about 15 minutes, Wyatt Reed, managing editor of The Gray Zone, will be with us. You know he's my roll dog. So come on back. All the ways to help the show. The links are down below. Thank you so much. It's time for Pasta to go, but I'll be right on back.